So we're going to do about 35 minutes of talking here, and then we'll do about 10 minutes of Q&A. So we'll get to the Q&A, and I'll give everybody a reminder. So one of the things I wanted to start with, Bridge, you're best known for foreign policy, for your views on China, but perhaps the reason why I think we are here, one of the reasons why I think you are one of the most important foreign policy voices in the United States, is because of your ability to connect foreign policy to economic interests and to geopolitical realities. So before we even get to Ukraine, China, or any of that, I was wondering if you could give us a lay of the land in a moment of international crisis of where we are right now for the challenges that we face, but more importantly, how they connect to the economic realities of the US economy.
Well, thank you, Saagar. Really appreciate it, and big admirer of yours. And also, Johnny, thanks a lot. Same, the feeling is very much mutual. So great to be here with a lot of friends and young people, and appreciate the thoughtful and incisive question. Look, I don't think it's an exaggeration. I'm always careful. You know, Churchill shouldn't be allowed to be captured by those who most quote him. But to say that there is a world crisis, I don't think is too much of an exaggeration at this point. And I think we see what's going on. Obviously, there's the largest war in Europe in 75 years. There's terrible atrocities against the Jewish people, the most significant since the Holocaust, and the potential for a broader regional war in the Middle East, and the possibility of a war, what I would call like a systemic war between the United States and China, God forbid. Why does that matter? I think, in particular, the last part is something that we need to kind of try to recenter, and I appreciate your kind words, Saagar. I mean, I think, and I know Oren is here and other people who have talked about, who've been real leaders in bringing home to us that economic prosperity and economic flows and so forth are not just kind of like self-generating, especially not self-generating in a positive way. They are a product of a particular order and national policy, and also international structure. International structure is what is ultimately decisive, because I'm a realist, so you go back to Hobbes or Thucydides, what is most decisive, unfortunately, in the world is lethal force. And lethal force ultimately is what will tell if it is challenged. What I think is at stake, in particular, to make it a little bit more concrete, is that if China dominates Asia, I think it's very clear, I don't think we really need to speculate at this point, that China is going to reshape the global economy away from our benefit. And that's not to say that everything that we've been doing or experienced in the last 50 or 60 years has been beneficial. But what I will say is two things. One, I think things will be a lot worse if China is able to recenter, and people like Michael Lind and Robert Atkinson have shown the importance of being at the center of global trade flows and so forth. But also that whatever it is that we want to seek to do to make our economic model better, that Oren and Lighthizer and all these other people are rightly talking about, it requires the power to do so. And I think, especially for those of us on the kind of ascendant sort of new right, or whatever kind of phrase you want to use, I think that should be very clear, that if you don't have the power, you won't be able to reshape things in your direction. Of course, there should be limits to that power. But if we're not the ones imposing that will, if it's the Chinese and the government in Beijing, I think we can be quite confident that we will be poorer, less free, and ultimately less secure.
Yeah, I want everyone to pay attention to the words that you're using, which are benefits, which is direction, and even coming back to a fundamental principle of freedom. Freedom is the ability to choose. When you lack that ability, it itself is what you want to fight for. It's why we are the country that we are. I want to start actually with Ukraine. This was an area where you've really been a leading voice on the conflict and bringing nuance. What has America learned about its industrial base, both in terms of our ability not to just support war, but possibly even have to fight a war in the future? What are the discrete lessons that people here can take away?
Well, I think it's huge, and I think the fundamental lesson is how important it is to have a robust defense industrial base. And that sounds like a kind of anodyne, wonky comment, but I think it's going to have systemic requirements and effects on our politics and our policy. What we're seeing from Ukraine is actually a rebuttal of some of the lessons, quote unquote, that were taken after, for instance, the Persian Gulf War, which was basically that our military was so adept and so skilled that it essentially had transcended a lot of the old school rules of war, like mass, like position, like attrition, like resolve, like the ability to produce. And I think what we're seeing very clearly in the Ukraine, even with the tremendous underperformance of Russian forces, particularly in the first year of the conflict, is actually that those rules still apply. And they will apply to us with the Chinese, who, by the way, have 200 times the shipbuilding capacity that we do. So if we are going to stand a chance of being able to protect that ability to have a balance of power that will allow us to to shape our own economic future. We need to be able to produce at scale, and so do our allies, but we in particular as what I think of as the cornerstone balancer of our coalition. And so what that means to me is we need to be able to produce rapidly at scale platforms and weapons, not only for ourselves, much more than we think we need, because we learn again and again and again that we are underarmed, but also to be able not to have this situation where we've given a lot to the Ukrainians and now we're heavily depleted. And just to take an example, 155 millimeter ammunition, shell ammunition, is something that we took from the stockpiles in Israel, and now we have to kind of scrounge ways, and those are things that could be useful for Taiwan, and we can go into some of the specifics. But we want to be able to give Israel the weapons it needs to fight the wars that it wants, but also India, South Korea, Poland, et cetera. And so what I think that means is from a national security and sort of geopolitical point of view, we need a more robust defense industrial base. If you're going to have a much stronger and more resilient and capable defense industrial base, I think you're going to need a stronger industrial base. Mm-hmm. And that should dovetail with the kind of new right industrial thinking that people are talking about. There's a real clear meeting of the minds, if you will, or alignment, and then use that to drive, because you're, in a sense, even Adam Smith admitted that you needed to be able to have a strong defense. If you're going to need that, then we're going to need to create that, even if it's not perfectly efficient. And that, in a sense, whatever Stephen Moore is going to say later, with all respect, we don't need efficiency is not the top objective. It's really the ability to produce at capacity.
Well, to dig into that, I mean, one of the promises, as you said, of the post-Desert Storm thinking was that the American empire can dominate through the use of finance, through our conquering of international finance. And sanctions are like the perfect vehicle for that. So we don't need an industrial base. We don't need defense, because our ability in order to set the rules of world commerce means that no nation will ever go against us. So at the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, we put these debilitating sanctions on Russia, and we're like, look, the Russian war machine will have no capacity whatsoever to wage war. And instead, we have seen that their forecasts have gone up. If anything, their defense industrial base has increased and become one of the most significant parts of their entire economy. What lesson can we learn from that, from their resilience of being a straight-up petro economy, being cut off from the rest of the world, and still being able to be not good, but fine, and fine is enough in a case like this?
I think a huge lesson that we should really draw from this, and there are other examples, but this one should really put it to bed, is that economic sanctions really don't matter that much. Mm-hmm. And that's very important, because so much of the debate and discussion in Washington, D.C. and in the foreign policy establishment is basically about sanctions. And two things. One, indisputably, sanctions are utterly failing to materially shift the Kremlin's decision-making.
Yes.
That is their actual purpose. People try to elide that, but that is their actual purpose. Second, even, and this is your point, Saagar, even in the more narrow and sort of probably certainly much more defensible objective of degrading the Russian war machine and the Russian economy, they're also failing. The Russians are selling $20 above the price cap. I was told by European intellectuals, very well informed, earlier today, the Russian munitions production is twice that, I believe, of the entire West, certainly maybe of the Europeans alone. But Russian weapons production has actually increased faster than we anticipated. And the Russian economy is growing faster than the British economy, and I believe the German economy this year. Yeah. So, and yet the whole point, the G7 meetings, the president's phone calls, well, these people are about sanctions. So we're gaining these things that are kind of slipping out of our hands. And, you look at the embargo on Cuba, the North Korea, sanctions just don't work very well. And so I think that's something we've really got to, digest from this experience.
It's a very important one. And another one that the Ukraine conflict, I think, illustrates, as you were just talking about, G7, the frankly religious obsession with Europe and with European affairs and just the cultural heritage. And all of that I completely understand, but as you often talk about, we're looking at 50% of world GDP, which thinks about this very, very differently. You spent a lot of time in the region, especially recently. I think, I came back from New Delhi. I was honestly shocked at the way that they are beginning to talk and turn on America, very much because of Ukraine. And we're talking about one of the largest economies and countries in the world with the largest population. How do we get to a point where we can both balance defense and economic priorities on that new nexus in Asia? What does that actually look like a real pivot to Asia, if you will?
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, this is what I struggle with, and there's so many things. I think one of them that you're putting your finger on, Saagar, is this Urophilia that is, honestly, it would be hilarious if it weren't so dangerous, yes. But it's bizarre to hear from a left-wing Democratic administration these rationalizations, and they occasionally poke out in open terms, that Europe is the most important region of the world. As a friend of mine calls it, he's a macroeconomist, it's like white supremacy, basically. It's like, why do we, well, Europe is 20 to 25% of global GDP going down to 10%. Asia's going to be upwards of 50%. Much more of the world's population, the youthful population, et cetera, et cetera. So just like objectively, I mean, if somebody wants to say, oh, all those figures are wrong, we could debate that. I've never seen a credible statement of that. But then why are we going, and that the Europeans will somehow help us when that's manifestly not really true. I think it has something to do. So, and I say that as somebody, I mean, my old friend Raihan Salam, was joking with me just how ironic it is to see someone who loves the Western tradition so much culturally and so forth. I'm very dedicated to it. But the West doesn't exist to me as a strategic entity that the United States should reckon with. Our foreign policy should be objective and rational and logical and based on the empirical, environment. And that's, the West as some kind of fuzzy thing is not really what we're going for. I think for a lot, I mean, this is where, and I've gone, the foreign policy establishment was designed to have quasi-monarchical elements. It has a courtier class of which I'm as guilty as anybody, but it's like, it's very much a creature of the imperial capital here. And Europe is very much part of it, and frankly, people are people. There are a lot of conferences in Europe. The Munich Security Conference is kind of a mecca. It's like these things take on a role, and they have a deep impact on people's lives. Like, one of the is the congressional plane that John McCain used to take to the Munich Security Conference. It's like people are falling all over themselves to get on it, and it's like, well, wait, that doesn't really reflect what. And so there's a principal agent problem, and that's so much of what we're going towards. And I think things are improving as people are, younger people are getting into the pipeline. But there's such a disjuncture between the attitude of the foreign policy establishment and what we need.
Yeah, the reason I kind of am trying to funnel things for this discussion is we start with Ukraine of what it shows us. Then we get to now we're actually looking at the language of interest of Europe and in Asia. But a backstop of all of this, and perhaps what you're best known for, and also in the discussion of your book, is Taiwan. So I actually was curious the thing I again appreciate the most is whenever I hear you talk about Taiwan or the case that you've often made for the defense of Taiwan, it's about hard, real American power, about interests, about the tangible effects on the lives of the American consumer, the American way of life, and none of it is nebulous talk about concepts of which we can easily hypocritically been thrown back into our face. I would love, because I'm sure there's probably people with some more restrained views here in the audience, if you can make the case for them in a language that I think we can all understand of interest.
Well, thank you. And that's how, I mean, look, I think people say realism isn't American, and I'm like, no, that's totally wrong, because the center of the American constitutional model is not the Bill of Rights, it's the separation of powers. Nobody should be entrusted with too much power. So I think it's the same logic applied to the international system. And also, self-interest is not bad when it's for the Republican good, small r, right? When it's for the citizenry's good, that's what it should be, because it was like a dynastic, monarchical foreign policy to like help, my cousin in some distant European land is the monarch of the despot of Zebia. I'm going to help him because we're related. No. You should do what's in the interest of the American people in concrete terms. That to me is what I think that's what American foreign policy should be about. Why does Taiwan matter? Taiwan doesn't matter in and of itself to Americans, and that's very important because defending Taiwan could be very, very costly. So the way I think about Taiwan is it's a conditional good for Americans, but it's very, very important nonetheless. And the key is to drive down the costs and risks of defending Taiwan to make it a manageable defense. What is it that Taiwan is important for Americans for? One is basically what this is about is preventing China from dominating Asia, which is 50% of global GDP. And if China dominated it, our lives would suffer very materially. Taiwan is critical to what I think of as this anti-hegemonic coalition, which is basically a coalition of countries including India, Japan, Philippines, potentially Vietnam to some extent, et cetera, et cetera. If we abandon Taiwan, or if we lose over Taiwan, countries in the region will then have a rational incentive to recalibrate and accommodate Beijing. And it's worth bearing in mind that the traditional model of East Asia was actually a more quasi-imperial sort of tributary model. So it's not completely ahistorical there. And we can get into credibility. Credibility is, in my view, I have a kind of moderate vision of credibility. Some academics say it doesn't matter. I don't think human life runs that way. If you want to get a mortgage, you got to get a credit report. The neoconservative establishment will say everything is connected. Mike Pence is saying what matters over here matters over there. That's also not true. It's more contextual. but can go into that. The second point is Taiwan's very important for militarily, and that's what really matters here in terms of shifting the power balance, is that if China's going to break out of this first island chain that runs along the Western Pacific, it has to get through Taiwan. So here's the bottom line. We may be put into a position where Taiwan is indefensible, which would be very, very dangerous, and we would have to grapple with that reality. But the situation will be worse then. That's the critical point for, I think, restrainers to grapple with. Is like, it's not like you're going to give over to China. I mean, it's very obvious that Chinese ambitions extend way beyond Taiwan. I mean, I was on a thing with them the other day. They say it's not true, but if you believe that, I have a bridge I'd like to sell you. Their military force development, their greater political activity all around the world, their relationships, et cetera, et cetera. And it makes sense for them. Of course they would do.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah. But that doesn't mean that we should accept it. So that's why I think it's worth defending Taiwan.
Okay. And it's important then to bring it back and to continue to think about what that means in terms of American policy, because I have now watched, and you alluded to this, we need to deplete our weapon stocks in Ukraine so that we can defend Taiwan. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. The more recent package that is currently being sold, so it connects to what's literally happening right now on Capitol Hill, is that, and this is the case from the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, that Israel and Ukraine and Taiwan are all interconnected. So I actually would love for you to just spend some time on that. And I have difficulty even taking that seriously. You have to spend some time in the room where you don't get to just be like me and mock them on a television camera. So what do you say whenever you get confronted with that? Because let's be honest, it is a common way of thinking in DC. It's frankly the predominant view, if I had to guess, at least amongst the, let's say, the average member of Congress who's a Republican. So how do we deconstruct that in terms and in language that they understand?
Yeah. I mean, it's a hard argument to argue against because it's very thin, I would say, and often superficial. Look, and one of the great frustrations I've had over the last 21 months in the Ukraine debates is I feel that the Hawk Party, the Hawk group, and I would consider myself a realist, so overlap but not the same, but the Hawk Party has not been consistent in their argument.
Yeah.
So realists, I think, and hawks, there's some similarity, but hawk, I would think, is somebody who really believes in the importance of firmness and military force. Both of them say what matters is hard power, and hard power relevant to the fight we're talking about. It's a clear-eyed vision of you're not going to, the way I put it is like, you're not going to defend Taiwan with Taiwan flashed hashtags against the PLA. Hawks should agree with that. But now we have a situation where John Bolton is writing in the Wall Street Journal that hard power is not, it can be, it's fungible. It can be, it's like, well, you can only use a missile once, right? And if I just said about economic sanctions, and Hawks have made that point, okay, well, what matters is military power. And we have limited military power. That's not for dispute. I mean, there are Republicans out there or others out there saying, well, we're investing in the defense industrial base. Even a cursory look at the news reveals that our defense industrial base is woefully inadequate for our situation. So, Aaron McClain, who used to work for Senator Cotton, is a friend of mine, differences, but I gave him a lot of credit a couple weeks ago because he said, look, we do have this problem. His argument was we should do more in the Middle East and Ukraine and take risk in Asia, if I understood it. I don't want to characterize his position. But I was like, amen, that's the kind of debate that we should be having. But this idea that it's all interconnected in this kind of nebulous cloud, it's like, well, wait a minute. Do we have enough missiles and mines and air defense and stuff to defeat the PLA or not? That's like it's not a completely objective question because it's inherently unknowable and subjective and dynamic. But it's like, that is what hawks should be talking about. And the thing that's really infuriating, Saagar, is that after 18 months of people saying, Bridge, you're exaggerating the degree of trade-offs. Now trade-offs are becoming conventional wisdom.
Yes.
Too late. Too late. Now we're in the hole. And obviously, the thing about like the Pence line about they're all connected is like, okay, let's say we take seriously the assertion that the fate of Taiwan will be determined in Ukraine. Okay, who cares among the recognized states of the world the most about Taiwan? China. Why would China not intervene in the Ukraine conflict directly if that were? No, instead China's behaving based on my framework, which is to say, hey, this is awesome. I can deplete and tie down and distract the Americans, and then I put myself in a better position, and now the Middle East too, such that the President of the United States, this guy who's always lecturing us about democracy versus autocracy, gets on national television in his Oval Office, didn't even mention China.
That's right.
That tells you everything you need to know. So a lot of these people, I actually wonder what their actual commitment to the China confrontation is. And I really worry about that.
Well, I think that they do it because rhetorically, and this is another thing that we often ignore, we do live in a democracy, and the people actually see things much more the way that you do. I mean, if you were to ask the American people and be like, put a list of the actual threats to who they think that is to the American way of life, they naturally can understand when you have a deep economic intertwinement, you have an imperial or a would-be imperial power near all of these U.S. allies, that it matters tremendously to their way of life. They're like, yeah, that's the main priority. So it seems to be more of a talking point. I'd love, you can respond to that if you would, but I also think it would be very useful, just because something I have also learned a lot from you is, again, the discrete nature on our actual ability, if we were to want to confront the PLA. Real hard terms in terms of just some statistics and other facts, again, that I've learned from you that can really stick, in my opinion, with a lot of people when they're out there in the world and also talking about that.
Well, thank you. No, I mean, just on the first one, I actually think, this sounds like I'm pandering, but I think it's actually true, which is that the American people actually sense the stakes much more because it connects the deindustrialization things that American Compass and others have been talking about, which is to say, look, like this has had a real effect. It doesn't have a real effect in the Beltway, on Wall Street, in LA, okay, but out there, especially with Republican voters, people get it. There's like this kind of ineffable, tectonic, brooding omnipresence kind of sense that that's what the stakes are. And what I'm trying to actually do is describe something that I think is already manifest to a lot of people. But the problem is that, and where I think a lot of the intra-conservative debates will go, is how far should we go militarily? And the point I would say is China's strong incentive is to create what I call a secure geoeconomic sphere. So if you think like a new right person here, which is to say having a more realistic assessment of the economy and the international economy, and you're China, and you believe that we are trying to strangle them under a left-wing administration, they believe that, I'm pretty confident. Actually, I've heard it from them repeatedly. Then you have a strong incentive to use the most effective means you can to create that secure market, that Atkinson and others are talking about, the importance of scale, to create trade flows around yourself, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to create national champions that will then supplant the Americans. How do you do that? Force. Can you do that? That's then that becomes the critical question. Are you going to win or are you going to lose? The very, very worrisome thing is that there is a realistic chance that they could win. Now, it's on a razor's edge. But my friend Dave Uckmanick, who has served in the Clinton and Obama administrations, one of the most respected military analysts in the country, he reported in a recent Rand Corporation assessment, nonpartisan, that we are on a trajectory to lose. And if you listen, especially to private conversations, there's a lot of pessimism. It is not irredeemable, I believe, yet, but we are really pushing the envelope. And the key thing, Saagar, is because of the Chinese people care a lot more than Taiwan than we do. So in that situation where the quote-unquote asymmetry of resolve favors the other side, you want to be stronger. And that's the paradox of the Biden administration is, he sounds like JFK, but he spends like Jimmy Carter. That sounds like a cheap kind of comment, but it's actually true because actually historically Democrats would be the ones who would say, look, I want to follow the law of war more, or whatever, their vision of the law of war, or I want to rely less on nuclear weapons, or da-da-da-da-da. I'm kind of a softer approach. But I still want to be able to defend our interests. Well, that would lead you to increase defense spending, which I'm skeptical the American people want, et cetera. But that's not what they're doing. So now we have a massive mismatch. And here's the fundamentally scary thing, Saagar, is I look at this and I think to myself, if I were a strategist in Beijing, this would look like a great opportunity to me.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it is the best opportunity on earth. They've got the West and the entire diplomatic corps obsessed with Ukraine, now with Israel. It's like, well, we're sitting pretty over here, as you said. You got an Oval Office address, the second only Oval Office address by the President of the United States in his term, and he doesn't even mention us. Why wouldn't we move right now? I want to move to something that you actually just talked about with defense spending, because this is another actually interesting and nuanced conversation. So the point that you often hear, let's be honest, correctly, from leftists is they're like, well, we spend $800-something billion and the Pentagon can't even account for, 30% of it. Why would we want to increase defense spending? You're talking about shipbuilding capabilities. Oh, that just sounds like we need another $100 billion. And I think Americans correctly are skeptical of the military industrial complex. It's a term which has now come, kind of surprisingly to me, to common parlance with just the average citizen who remains deeply, deeply skeptical of it, especially in the face of Ukraine, corruption, Iraq, Afghanistan, if you just watch whatever the hell happened there in 2021. So what is the case that you can make for increasing the industrial base for spending, or is it about recalibration of spending? What's the politically sustainable case for these lawmakers to make to the American people?
Well, I don't think the common view among many of the sort of hawks, which is beatings will continue until morale improves, sort of approach of like, hey, just harangue people more and they'll want to spend more on defense. I think American people are fair. We're spending almost $1 trillion on defense, and we're worried about losing to China, the Afghanistan debacle, Iraq, et cetera. I mean, I don't know why we're listening to the people who for the last generation have presided over this situation. I mean, that's a really poor record, right? And I see some of these guys on TV around me or whatever, and I'm like, why are we listening to these people, right? I mean, so totally with, and like some of the most sort of moralistic and avid people on Ukraine were architects of the Iraq disaster. David Frum called me a dreamer the other day, which I thought was like sort of like some kind of like apotheosis of irony or whatever. But, that is like, okay, I'm delighted to be criticized by David Frum, please more. So I totally sympathize with that. But the problem is, and I'm very careful as a defense kind of strategy person, not to be kind of like I'm talking my own book, in the sense of like, I think a lot of people tune out when people like me start to talk about defense spending. But here's what I'll say. We need to spend enough to be able to deal with the Chinese and also protect the homeland, go after terrorists, have a nuclear deterrent. That's the basics. I go into that in my book. And in my view, we should spend what that costs. Now, we should try to do it more efficiently, but, efficiency and reform are difficult. What I would say is, and this is where I think the new right can play and can also have leverage, is to say, yes, we're going to help the defense industrial base and perhaps spend more, but that's going to be as part of a reindustrialization effort. And we're going to create steel mills in Ohio again, like Senator Vance was saying maybe. So drive that point home. It's like, because the blobby types will want to spend more, but we're not just going to give it to stock buyback options for Raytheon. Maybe you break up the primes. I don't know if the antitrust is the right thing, but it's at least saying things to me that seem to kind of get after the problem, that we should have competition. Again, I'm not sure what the answer is, but I'm sympathetic to that. And I think that kind of coalition could actually, and there are others on the left, the Ro Khannas of the world, who could be brought along on that.
Yeah, that was actually where I wanted to go, is obviously we live in a country where it's going to require at least some sort of bipartisanship. Obviously, Ukraine is one of the most bipartisan issues I've seen in a long time. So how do you get the bipartisanship? You just mentioned people like Ro Khanna. He's got a counterpoint like Mike Gallagher. There's some very serious people. But, let's be honest, we can probably name them on two hands. We can count the number, whereas they've got hundreds really on their side. What does a bipartisan coalition like this actually look like, and what are goals that can be sold not only just to the Republican base or even just to a Republican lawmaker, but one that a Democratic lawmaker may be able to.
Well, I think like a Jake Sullivan. I mean, I think he's been talking a lot about the defense industrial base. I think this guy, if a president was saying we need to do this, we need to reindustrialize the country, it's not going to be just total deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthy kind of stuff. It's going to be designed to regrow a strong industrial base. I mean, I think a lot of Democrats would probably find that almost irresistible just on substance, but certainly politically, if you're sitting in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Michigan and you're voting against that. So, I mean, obviously a ton of this that this administration and some of the congressional leadership uses, a lot matters how you present the thing. If a Republican administration along these lines comes in and says, here, we'd welcome Democratic co-sponsors or whatever, here's the legislation, do you want to get on board or do you want to oppose this?
Yeah.
I think that could be pretty compelling.
Another thing I think a lot of Republicans and even that we will all look at this is how much of this actually matters in terms of the debate. And one of the reasons I wanted to ask for you is you actually worked inside the beast. You were inside of the Pentagon. So I'm curious if you could speak to people who I think correctly are very skeptical of the deep state, of a permanent bureaucracy. How do we go about speaking the language that they might, and do we have to remove them, as Vivek Ramaswamy was talking about? Can they be persuasive? Can they work towards our ends? What does effective political administration on this actually look like?
Well, I think, I guess what I would say is I'm definitely sympathetic. There have been some huge abuses of federal power. And this notion that the security state should be like above investigation is kind of deeply un-American and sort of hilarious. And in fact, ironically, and I've studied this period in some depth, like we went through this in the 70s from the other side, right? Which is that the left was all suspicious, and now the right is. So like, and yet we still won the Cold War. So we can have, my view is we can have accountability, and there should be more political accountability. And the reason why we have political appointees is for democratic accountability. Now, obviously you want basic competence or whatever, but the countervailing point is it is a dangerous world, and we need a security establishment, but that security establishment should be very clear. So I would support firings of like senior officials who've been even complicit in this, you know, and people should understand that there are not areas, you know, for instance, like in the military or else, if you're participating in like, you know, abuses of power or you're overly political or whatever, there should be accountability, you know, and people should be held to that standard. And I think, I think this is very important, but I do think we do need the sort of security. The last thing I'd said, I remember I saw a very prominent retired four-star who's had some political roles a few years ago, and he was just talking about the military like it was this oasis of, you know, kind of professionalism and apoliticism, and this one was hilarious. It was not careerist. It was like, well, that's not. I mean, like, we respect the military, but it's definitely a careerist institution. But I was like, you know, we need to remember that the messy politics is the feature of our system, and the standing security establishment is the bug. We do need those things. It's like our soft empire. It's actually not, ideally we would not have to do it. We would be a republic and we could pursue kind of splendid isolation, but it's not realistic. And so, but that's the kind of mindset that I would use to approach that.
So my last question for you, Marshall, my co-host on the Realignment podcast, often uses this, is what time is it? And I really like to look at history and like what exact era are we rhyming in? What is it? Is it 1914? Is it 1937? Is it, should we go farther back? I mean, what are some analogous time periods we can look to and learn from their mistakes, and then from some of the lessons that they were able to give us so that we don't do the same thing?
Well, I think the thing that I'm a big fan of Marshall, the thing I like about the what time is it is more like what time is it now and where are people's heads. And I was talking to Johnny about the comment that he gave to the Free Press about a year ago that was just really stuck with me, that young conservatives are like so done with like neoconservatism, and it's like they know, and I thought Vivek had definitely the upper hand in the exchange with Vice President Pence, where he's like, it ain't 1983 anymore, you know. That said, I will say there's a little bit of 1979 from a military point of view, where there's a resurgent authoritarian power. We have local military. So the Cold War thing a little bit, but it tends to be overused. It's a little bit of 1938 in that like stuff's really going down all over the world and we need to focus on rearmament. It's a little bit of 1910 because China and Imperial Germany have echoes. So right. I don't mean to be evasive, but I think
these are good.
Yeah, like no one period is a perfect match.
Lesson, just read about all three. All right, so we got time for a little bit of Q&A. The rules are you actually have to ask a question, and I will cut you off if you start making a statement. So I see a hand up over there. Let's go to that.
Thanks, Bridge, and thanks, Saagar. Bridge, I'm wondering where Bidenomics goes wrong. Which parts of Bidenomics are good, which parts of Bidenomics are bad, and what a Republican industrial strategy would look like that you could tell Jake Sullivan, you're wrong, here's what we're doing better.
Well, I may punt on this one. I know Oren's on a future panel, or Saagar could ask her. I mean, in terms of the whole Bidenomics thing, my main point from what I feel that I can maybe productively say is I would put much more active, like top-level emphasis on the revamping of the defense industrial base. I mean, Jake Sullivan spending a half an hour a day on 155 millimeter shell production ain't gonna cut it. And what they've done so far is pretty marginal relative to the scale of the challenge. I think we Republicans, conservatives, if we had the chance to pull the levers, we would need to be prepared to make much bigger moves. Like, for instance, and I mean, I think, what kind of federal regulation is inhibiting this stuff? I don't know. Well, let's waive it, and then we'll litigate it. I mean, as Obama said, I've got a pen and a phone. Like, let's see what we can do.
Good point. All right. I see a hand up over here.
This question is about, I guess, investment into China by Western companies and also Taiwanese companies themselves. How do we make sure that our allies go along and don't neuter our own policy of rebuilding our industrial base? You've said specifically that we shouldn't expect Europe to have the same interests in Asia. Mm-hmm. If they don't have the same interests, do we coerce them, or what do we do?
Good question. That's a great question, and others would have a better sense of exactly what to do. I mean, I'm actually, from a strategic point of view, I'm less concerned about decoupling, or I have a slight difference with my friend Oren. I don't think as a strategic matter, full-scale decoupling is necessary because economic sanctions are not that effective with a couple of exceptions. So in that sense, I do kind of agree with Sullivan about the high fences and small yard, although I don't think the Chinese perceive it that way, frankly. But what really matters is the military balance. We should pursue decoupling for our own purposes, but on our own timeline that's informed by the strategic approach. I mean, I think the Biden administration tends to look at our alliances as these sort of gauzy, sacred things, as the president says. I think we should look at them as like business partnerships, close friendships, business partnerships. But in that sense, okay, let's look at what Germany, is Germany going to be able to decouple from the Chinese economy rapidly? No, because it's deeply dependent on exports okay, so let's be realistic about that. What can we ask? What kind of regulations would that require, et cetera? So the one thing I would say is we do have an interest in a stronger defense industrial base among our allies, because if we expect our allies to consistently spend more on defense, which is what we should want if we don't want to keep getting in wars all over the world, particularly, then they need to cycle some of that money into their own economies. So because of the demand will be greater, I think we can regrow our own defense industrial base. But this is one of the fallacies that the kind of blobby Republicans will say, oh, all this money's coming home. But there's a huge rat in the boa constrictor problem,
right,
which is, the New York Times reported this a couple days ago. These weapon systems are being delayed out for years and years because there's not enough capacity in our own country. We should fix that, but it's going to take a while. And we've got bigger problems, trains coming at us before that time arrives.
I see a hand up over here, sir. He'll bring you a mic.
I'm quoting from a 2021 article in Military Review, a publication of the U.S. Army, which says that China has enough ballistic and cruise missiles and with enough anti-ship missiles to attack every U.S. surface combatant vessel in the South China Sea with enough firepower to overcome each ship's missile defense. If that is, first of all, do you think that's true? And secondly, if it is true, do we not need a transformation of military technology as dramatic as what Reagan did with the
Star Wars,
smart weapons, Star Wars, and so forth?
Well, the situation is actually even worse than that. The Chinese have such ballistic cruise, multiple launch rocket systems, and other capabilities to attack not only U.S. surface combatants within the first island, even the second island chain, but U.S., Japanese, and Philippine bases throughout, possibly even Australian bases with their kind of missiles that are coming online. That is a known problem. It's a very serious one, but this is why U.S. forces rely in particular for denial defense against the Chinese attack on Taiwan on systems like attack submarines, on systems like long-range bombers, unmanned systems that can be produced, hence this replicator initiative that the Pentagon is pursuing. Because the Chinese, at the end of the day, and I go into this a lot in my book, the Chinese have a very difficult problem of projecting and sustaining decisive military force on the island of Taiwan. It's not impossible, that's why I'm so worried about it, but it is not by any stretch a walk in the park. And if there is a sort of everybody kind of is inhibited from moving, basically the United States and Taiwan and Japan prevail because the Chinese will have failed to achieve their political objective. In terms of the transformation of military technology, the transformation of military technology that goes back or even earlier into the early 70s and was carried on under people like Harold Brown and Bill Perry under the Carter administration and was really capitalized by the Reagan administration, that was very important. I think what we're seeing here is we do need advances in technology. The problem is the Chinese themselves are also moving forward on technology. So this is where the defense industrial base becomes very important because we need to produce at scale for attritional conflict. We need position and we need resolve with our allies and partners. This is why it's very important that Taiwan do a lot more, that Japan does a lot more, et cetera. But I don't think, we don't want to put our eggs in the basket of like a Star Wars, because ultimately at the end of the day, Star Wars actually didn't succeed as a military program. People argue about what impact it had on the Soviet leadership, but from a military point of view, it was not an optimal investment. So, here we need to have a real, now, that's not all Reagan invested in, so that's, it worked out, but we need to be able to cover down, and I think, and then there is a sort of part of the thinking of the Republican coalition going back to Reagan that there's a kind of idea of like almost transformational or magical sort of transformations of our military capability that I think the Ukraine war hopefully should disabuse us of.
Yes.
That we need to be, because also the other side is working very actively. And a lot of these technological situations, especially after the opening phases of a war, when you've kind of fired your wonder weapons, you're going to go back to the old-fashioned kind of stuff.
That's right. All right, I'm getting the nod. It's time for us to end. So, Bridge, really appreciate it. Thank you very much, sir.
All right. Thanks a lot.